In this video, I'm going to be talking about atheism as a path to spiritual enlightenment. I know that sounds strange. First, I need to explain what atheism is and what enlightenment is. Then I can show how they're related to one another. Atheism and spirituality seem mutually exclusive to many people. Atheism, as it's popularly understood, is synonymous with materialism and the rejection of belief in the existence of anything supernatural or immaterial. This reflects a very shallow philosophical understanding of atheism, though, I think. Strictly speaking, atheism is a position on the question of the existence of God. Materialism is a position on the question of the nature of reality. The question of the nature of reality is a separate question from the question of the existence of God. But for many people, these two positions seem to be compatible with each other within the context of a larger worldview. That greater worldview is often labeled as atheism. And I think this is the source of the confusion. And I think this is why people sometimes say that atheism is a religion. This new atheism, as it's sometimes called, is a worldview, but not a religion. Not all worldviews are religious. So there's a lot of confusion about what atheism is. And many of the so-called new atheists are guilty of exploiting this confusion in a disingenuous way, in my opinion. In debates, I frequently hear atheists attack religion from the position of atheism as a worldview, but then when challenged to defend atheism as a worldview, they retreat and hide behind the definition of atheism as a simple position on the philosophical question of God's existence. So to avoid committing this same dishonesty, let me be as clear as I can about what I mean by atheism for the purposes of this discussion. When a child is born, the child is an atheist. The atheism of the child is not the atheism of Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, though. This atheism isn't a worldview. It isn't scientific materialism. It isn't an intellectual denial of the existence of supernatural intelligence or immaterial substance. It isn't even a rejection of or conscious disbelief in the existence of God. It's simply an absence of any belief. It's not the word God written on a page and then crossed out. It's simply the page itself with nothing yet written on it. According to the Christian scriptures, Jesus taught that to come to knowledge of truth, it's necessary to become like children, to be born again. Your mind has to be free from dogma. Knowledge can only be found once faith is lost. Concepts of God and beliefs about God are like graven images. They're false gods. This is the esoteric meaning of the commandment not to make graven images, and not to have any gods before the true God, before truth itself, in other words. The third commandment is essentially about not making an idol of the name of God. The first three commandments, which are the ones most atheists like the least, actually command atheism and condemn religion if you think about it. The first commandment is about reality itself. To have no gods before God means to hold no concept of truth above truth itself. The second commandment is a logical extension of the first. It's about our beliefs about reality, which separate us from reality. To form graven images is to form dead mental constructs. When we form beliefs about reality, and mistake those beliefs for truth itself, we become separated from reality. The third commandment is a logical extension of the second. After we form concepts about reality in our minds, we use words to label those concepts. In other words, we give our graven image of God a name. Now we're even further separated from reality. We get so lost in words that we lose sight of the concepts that the words point to. And even the concepts the words point to are only concepts and not the truth itself. The third commandment is also about literalism. The literal word is meaningless or vain. To use the name of God in vain is to talk about God in a literal way. I don't want to go into the full esoteric or Kabbalistic interpretation of the Ten Commandments, but I will mention that each corresponds to the point on the tree of life and represents a phase of spiritual ascension. The first three are the highest phases. I'm going to skip over the fourth commandment for now and go straight to the fifth. I may do a separate video covering all 10 commandments at some point. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'm mostly interested in the first 3. But in short, the commandment to honor your father and mother is about tradition and authority. Catholics honor the father, the priest, and the mother, the church. And for a long time, the scriptures of the church were not available to the layperson, but were received only through the father and mother, through the church. The Protestant Reformation was a kind of ascension up the ladder. The scripture, or the word, the name, became available to the people, and this superseded the authority of the church, the father and mother. But of course the Protestant church violates the third commandment by reading the word literally, using the name of God in vain. As scientific knowledge has increased, literal interpretations of the Bible have been questioned and rejected by many, in favor of a more metaphorical or spiritual interpretation. This is the ascension to the level of the second commandment, which deals with the concepts that the words merely point to. The challenge at this level is to obey the first commandment by going beyond concepts, by rejecting belief and knowing the truth directly by having an immediate experience of pure reality. This is why atheism is necessary to ascend to the highest levels of enlightenment. At the level of honor your father and mother, the atheist challenges and rebels against institutional religious authority. At the level of use not the name of God in vain, the atheist challenges and rebels against the literalist interpretation of Scripture. And at the level of have no graven images, the atheist challenges the concepts of religion and demands that beliefs be subjected to reason. Having succeeded in this, exoteric religion dissolves into esoteric spirituality, and the level of the first commandment is reached. To truly obey the first commandment is to achieve spiritual enlightenment or union with God. The task of the atheist is to return to the childlike atheism of pre-belief rather than disbelief. This is where the tension between faith and atheism, which drives the spiritual evolution of humanity, dissolves. An illuminated person who is one with God is an atheist, because God is an atheist. God has no God. The religion of God is self-knowledge, illumination. It isn't a conceptual knowledge. It's more like pure being. It might be better described as non-existence. Enlightenment is nothing short of the direct experience of God's non-existence. Enlightenment is the direct knowledge rather than the mere belief in atheism, in other words. I'm not just playing word games to be paradoxical here, but I'm going to offer you the phrase, God doesn't exist, as a kind of Zen riddle to meditate on. I'm using language to express concepts to point toward a direct knowledge and experience. I'm breaking the first 3 of the 10 commandments in order to reveal the secret to obeying them in order to ascend the mountain. This is the significance to the fact that Moses broke the stone tablets in coming down from the mountain to give the 10 commandments to the people. It symbolizes the fact that when an individual experiences truth directly, he can only communicate the truth by conceptualizing and then verbalizing it. Now, some people might feel like I haven't really explained atheism as a path to spiritual enlightenment yet. So for those who are more interested in practice than theory, I'll lay out a basic outline for the seeker who is interested in atheism as a path to spiritual illumination. But I discourage the seeker from viewing it as a technique. First of all, if you believe in God, it may be hard for you to stop believing. This is simply attachment to a belief. And overcoming attachments is a common goal of spiritual practices. Probably the hardest attachments to break are the attachments to our beliefs. This is why atheism is superior to Buddhism and other paths. There's a catch-22 in Zen Buddhism. The Zen student wants to free himself from all attachments and desires, but they can never win because they're attached to their belief that attachments are bad. They desire to be free from desire. A person who is attached to detachment can't free himself from this attachment, because his very attempt to let go of his attachment to the goal of detachment is based on his attachment to the goal of detachment. His desire to be free from his desire, to be free from desire, is based on his desire to be free from desire. The atheist path avoids this trap. Atheism as a spiritual path has a different trap, though. If you become an atheist because you believe that by becoming an atheist you can know God, then you're not really an atheist, and it won't work. This is why I say not to view it as a technique. Ironically, there may be an atheist watching this video thinking that I'm really saying that God exists and that I'm only recommending atheism as a path to knowing God, and they might ask me to prove that God exists. Well, that would be pretty stupid, wouldn't it? Why would I try to convince someone to be an atheist by trying to convince them that God exists? I want to convince you that God doesn't exist. And if God does exist, then the only way you can ever know God is to be an atheist. Whatever God you believe in is a word. It's a name you're using in vain. Or at best, it's a graven image in your head. It's a concept. And that concept isn't God. If there is a God, it isn't your concept of God. Have no graven images. To believe in God is to believe in a false God. No God you believe in can ever be real. Whatever God you believe in will only be imaginary, so don't believe in God. This is the best argument for atheism I can give you if you're a theist. Don't trick yourself, though. Don't conceive of an inconceivable God and then believe in that. Don't imagine that a God exists beyond your imagination and believe in that. Don't believe. God doesn't exist. Of course, there's endless reasons not to believe in any particular religion. Most religious people are very adept at spotting the contradictions and absurdities in other religions. Robert Spencer has done some of the best work I've come across when it comes to exposing Islam for the disgusting and ignorant religion that it is. Yet he seems incapable of applying his considerable intellectual and critical tools to dismantling his own religion, Christianity. He's like the man Jesus describes who points to the speck in his neighbor's eye but is completely blind to the plank in his own eye. Jesus says that first you should remove the plank from your own eye so that you can see clearly to remove the speck from your neighbor's eye. So if you follow Jesus' advice, you'll be an atheist, not a Christian. Whatever you believe, question it. Whatever you can question, doubt. This is where the path of atheism begins. But many atheists these days doubt God and then stop. I advocate a consistent atheism, a consistent skepticism. A person of intellectual integrity cannot be an atheist and a materialist. Most atheists today are materialists, and most people think that being an atheist basically requires you to be a materialist. After all, if there's no supernatural realm, then all that remains is the natural realm. If there's no spirit, then there's only the body. But I say this is wrong. It is logically inconsistent for an atheist to be a materialist. The number one atheist argument is that disbelief is the default position, and that unless a truth claim can be proven, belief should be withheld. And I agree with this. The argument goes on that the burden of proof rests with the person who's making the positive truth claim. And I agree with this too. If someone claims that God exists, they have the burden to prove that God exists. And until they can provide proof that God exists, the default position is disbelief. The atheist has no burden to prove that God doesn't exist. It's impossible to prove a negative. This is the argument, and it's true. So how can we believe in materialism then? How can you believe that there is an objectively real, material universe that exists outside your mind, independently of your perception of it? The person making the positive claim that the universe exists has the burden of proof. Well, what is the proof that the material universe exists? Unless you can prove it, disbelief is the default position. It's impossible to prove that objective material reality exists. So an atheist who criticizes a theist for believing in the existence of God without proof is a hypocrite if he believes in the existence of the material universe without proof. Now, the materialist will try to come up with arguments for the existence of the material universe, just like the theist will try to come up with arguments for the existence of God. But the arguments for the existence of the material universe will fall apart just as quickly as the arguments for the existence of God when the same critical logic is applied to them. So the only intellectually consistent position for the atheist is to be an immaterialist. If anyone thinks they have an argument for materialism, please make a response video and post a link, or leave a formal written argument in the comments section. I'll be happy to dismantle it for you. Even Descartes only managed to overcome his brain in a vat dilemma by an appeal to God's existence. And a version of his argument is used by Christian presuppositional apologists. I reject the presuppositional argument, and I've dealt with that in another video. The title of that video is The Divine Solipsism Debate, if you want to check it out. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it contains a formal refutation of the arguments. The presuppositional argument fails as an argument for God, but it succeeds in exposing the fact that the materialist has absolutely no foundation to stand on. So, even if the Christian fails to support his own position, he at least succeeds in taking the materialistic atheist down with him. This leaves me the last man standing. An atheist who is logically consistent is an immaterialist and isn't affected by the presuppositional argument. Atheistic immaterialism is the position of disbelief in both the existence of God and the material universe, and is the only rational and consistent position to take. In some ways, this simple act of intellectual integrity, of rejecting belief in materialism along with belief in God, brings you around full circle in an odd way. You find you've gone through the looking glass. When you lose faith in God but continue to cling to your faith in materialism, the spiritual side of existence vanishes. This is why many people fear abandoning faith. Like the Hebrew slaves in Egypt, they hesitate to follow Moses into the desert. Even having done so, many are tempted to return to the bondage of Egypt or religion. Others die in the desert, being afraid to enter into the promised land. But those who persist, and who have the courage to abandon materialism as well as theism, will come to a land flowing with milk and honey. The fool who persists in his folly will become wise, says William Blake. The fool, according to the Bible, has said in his heart that there is no God. Now, to me, this doesn't mean that it's foolish to say there is no God. The fool here is a man who realizes his own ignorance. The religious man believes himself to be wise. He thinks he knows that there's a God, but he doesn't know. But the atheist realizes his ignorance. He knows that he doesn't know that God exists. So when the fool says in his heart that there is no God, this is a recognition of his own ignorance. And if he persists in his folly, if he continues to become aware of the full extent of his ignorance, he'll realize that he doesn't know that the material universe exists either. He will realize that the extent of his knowledge is that he exists as a conscious being. I think, therefore I am. In this way, the fool who persists in his folly becomes wise, in that he knows what he doesn't know. It's here that the seeker approaches the final mystery at the end of the spiritual path of atheism. Some may recognize at this point that I've led them into a prison with no doors or windows. Without faith in God, without faith in a material universe that exists outside of your mind, aren't you just left with solipsism? So have I led you out of Egypt and through the wilderness only to lead you into a cave with no way in or out? Yes, and I'm afraid I'll have to leave you there. There's no way out of this prison. God himself can't escape from the prison of solipsism. After an eternity of solitary confinement, he tried creating the world as a form of escape. But the world existed inside his mind, inside the prison. He could escape into this world in the same sense that an insane person can escape from reality by entering into an insane delusion. But he couldn't escape from the prison of his own mind. Of course, you're an atheist, so you don't believe in God. But if there is no God, if there is no material universe, and if all that exists is your own mind, and the thoughts and experiences that exist within your mind, then you are God. So the prison only exists in your mind. And if you're God, and if God doesn't exist, then you don't exist. There is no prison to escape from, and no prisoner to escape from it. There's only freedom. To experience this directly is illumination. This experience is where the path of atheism leads, if you follow it all the way to its end. But there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. I wish you well on your journey. Thanks for listening. Be sure to hit the like button, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.